Today's lecture is on the hermeneutics of aesthetics and how they are used for interpretation and better understanding. And I think that one of the interesting things with this is this is what I wrote my master's thesis on at Princeton when I was studying religion there at the seminary. And I met another person. This was back in 1994, 1990. So it was in 1987 to 1990. And I just recently met another person who did his doctoral thesis on the same subject matter. And we're currently in the process of writing a chapter together for the new book on pastoral care and counseling. I don't have any notes to put up for the lecture, so you can just listen to the lecture. You can take notes if you want, or you can just relax and listen. I'm going to be talking about how we incorporate all types of aesthetics, even aspects of expressive arts therapy, how we incorporate all of those in interpreting and better understanding what it is to be human, our lives, finding meaning, different events, different thoughts and feelings, emotions. So it becomes a very important part of our lives, and yet it's often neglected when it comes to counseling and psychology. Let's look briefly at the definition of hermeneutics. There is philosophical hermeneutics. There is theological hermeneutics. And I think that when we look at it theologically, which is one way it took root in the United States, in Europe, it's often a way to examine and interpret scriptures so that we might better understand what was written. And there's been some really interesting philosophical advances in hermeneutics as well, the way we interpret anything. But hermeneutics was first used in examining the written word and the oral word. So, hermeneutics is the theory and methodology of text interpretation, especially the interpretation of scriptures, spiritual texts, wisdom literature, and philosophical texts. Hermeneutics was initially applied to the interpretation or exegesis of scriptures. It emerged as a theory of human understanding in the late 18th and early 19th centuries through the work of Friedrich Schleiermacher and Wilhelm Dilthey. Modern hermeneutics includes both verbal and nonverbal communication, as well as semiotics, presumptions, and pre-understandings. The term hermeneutics and exegesis are sometimes used interchangeably. Hermeneutics is a wider discipline which includes written, verbal, and nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is semiotics. Exegesis focuses primarily upon the texts. Hermeneutic is a singular noun, refers to some particular method of interpretation. Hermeneutic consistency refers to the analysis of texts to achieve a coherent explanation of them. Philosophical hermeneutics refers primarily to the theory of knowledge initiated by Martin Heidegger and developed by Hans Georg Gadamer. In his Truth and Method, sometimes refers to the theories of Paul Ricoeur. And I'll be talking primarily about the theories of Paul Ricoeur. He really talked about examining literature. But when I wrote my thesis, it's interesting because in my undergraduate, I was an English literature major, and that's how I learned about Paul Ricoeur, about O-N-G, The Power of the Word. It's the book he wrote, and about a lot of other English literature critics. Another one would be Northrop Frye, and he incorporated the concepts of Jung, myth, metaphor, and archetype, with hermeneutics and the works of Paul Ricoeur to examine great works of literature, how they spoke to us as human beings, as individuals. Now, when I say scriptures, it's not only biblical, it's not only Christian, it could be Talmudic, which is Jewish, Vedic, or Vedic, which is Hindu, biblical, which would lean more towards Christian, philosophical, works of Plato, Aristotle, and other philosophers. So I think it is a really interesting area of study that we haven't really looked at yet. Psychology is starting to look at it when they look at the psychology of artificial intelligence. When psychology begins to incorporate some existential concepts, or when they incorporate some of the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, and it's also influential in humanistic psychology. So, let's talk a little bit more about how it applies to us in this course. So what I did was, because I was an English lit major and psychology minor in undergrad, I really looked at some of those critics of literature. They were talking about how the great works of literature, what made them great works, were their themes. Northrop Frye, combined with Paul Ricoeur, really talked about the combination of Jung's theory with humanistic psychology and hermeneutics. So then, my next degree was in cross-cultural religions and pastoral counseling. And so then I learned more about hermeneutics, only more scriptural hermeneutics. And the professors I had in that degree were multidisciplined individuals. They were Renaissance, liberal arts professors. So they had a nice foundation in a number of different disciplines, including philosophy, psychology, literature, things like that. So they were able to incorporate a lot of these ideas as well. I was always interested in art myself. always took an art class here and there when I could, and I find it very enjoyable. Art, music, huge music fan. I think some of the real existential moments that I've experienced had to do with experiencing art or aesthetics in one way or another. So let me share some things personally, some personal examples of this. When I talk with my friends about, well, what makes a great novel? What makes a classic? One of the answers, to me at least, is that when I read a novel, and it does a number of things, it speaks to me as an individual. It lets me know that I'm not alone in the way I feel or experience the world, that my subjective reality of life is in some ways unique, but in some ways not unique. Other people have experienced my thoughts, my feelings, my desires, my faith, my beliefs. So it creates a universality. Because a good novel can touch upon the human condition and create some clarity for the reader. It provides universalism, lets them know, hey, you're not the only one experiencing this. You're not alone here. But it also provides insight into that human condition to create awareness within the reader and promote growth in some way. Insight into the human condition. So that was why I really became an English Lit major. I just loved reading really good works of literature, and I still do. I don't have as much time, but I still do. So I think the things that really touched me were, or spoke to me, were books that were not just books on philosophy, they were novels, but when they told the story of somebody's life, it translated existential philosophy and gave me an example through the human condition, through the story of somebody's life. So it created a picture for me of these existential concepts, an example that I could more fully understand and grasp and apply to my own life. Music, boy, I started listening to the radio, and then records, and then 8-tracks, and then cassettes, and then CDs. Now I'm back to records again. But whenever a song comes on, I can usually remember where I was, or perhaps I was doing something or with somebody, and that song was playing. So music can create good links to memories and experiences. But music is also a form of poetry put to sound and rhythm. So poetry speaks to us in a different way than just literature telling a story. Poetry and music is symbolic. So it uses symbols. It incorporates myth, metaphor, and archetype. It alludes to a larger picture, and we have to fill in those blanks. Or it adds depth to an emotion. So music is another interesting type of art. Pictures, paintings, drawings, sculptures, all of those things. I can spend hours in a museum, and think about your senses. Think about the five senses. Chefs can create works of art, and now the newest chefs incorporate smells, tastes, textures. They use all your senses, sounds, into the eating experience. So they might want to create a meal that brings back memories of the fall, of campfires, leaves. And so they'll use the colors of fall. They'll use the food that people would traditionally eat in the fall, but they would elevate it. So for instance, they might vaporize things that you would put in a campfire, and then they would have a cover over your plate, and they would put that vapor under the cover, the glass cover. So you see this glass cover on your plate, and it's smoky. When you lift it up, the smoke wafts up from the meal, and you smell it, and it automatically triggers memories of a campfire in the fall. And then you see through this smoke, as it moves away, it reveals one serving of your meal. And it could be anything. It could be kind of a gourmet s'more. You know why they call them s'mores? Because it tastes like some more. So there's all kinds of different artistic factors in this. But think about all of our different senses and art. And we experience art with all of our senses. I remember one time I was in a museum. I was a little boy, and I saw the painting of the water lilies. And back then, and even today in some museums, they don't have roped off paintings. You can walk right up to them. And I couldn't help reaching out my hand and feeling the texture of that painting. And alarms went off, and that was about it. So think about how you use all of your senses to experience art. So let's talk a little bit about the concept of the combination of aesthetics and hermeneutics. So if hermeneutics is an understanding of a text, I see it as, if somebody is using a hermeneutic, it's a method to understand. And I believe counselors can use hermeneutics to better understand the human condition in their sessions. And then through hermeneutics, you can use hermeneutics to interpret something. You can interpret literature. You can interpret art. You can interpret music through the use of hermeneutics. And I believe that hermeneutics should not be limited to just the written word or the verbal, oral word. I believe it extends to all forms of art, and that the written word and the oral means of communication is just one form of aesthetics or one form of art. So when you use hermeneutics to better understand scriptures. It's almost like interpreting the spirituality of a piece of art. So how does it do that? It's more than just, oh, what does this passage mean? It's more than that. So let me try to explain this concept a little better for you. Let me picture yourself listening to a meaningful song or looking at a meaningful painting or experiencing the smells of something very specific that brings back memories, or reading one of your favorite books or poems. So when an artist, could be a writer, could be a painter, could be a sculptor, could be any type of artist, when they create a work of art, whether it be a novel or a painting or a sculpture or a piece of music or a poem, anything artistic, could be a dancer, when they create this, it no longer belongs to them. They are giving that piece of art to humanity. So an artist can't say, this is what this piece of art means. It only means that to them. It no longer belongs to them, so the interpretation and the experience of that art no longer belongs to them. It belongs to the person who is experiencing that piece of art. The listener, the viewer, the taster, whoever it is, the reader. So the only thing that that artist can hope for is that when an artist creates, they are both thinking and feeling something. And if it's a great work of art, they are experiencing something fully in the present. And there is usually an emotion attached to that, and there is some human meaning attached to that for them when they are creating. So when an artist creates, they begin painting in the morning, and they paint all day and all night, and they are fully in the present, and they are experiencing an emotion, a state of mind, whatever they are experiencing fully in that moment, and putting all of that into their work of art. And when it's done, there's nothing left to do to make that work of art better for them. It's easy to criticize things. Nothing is perfect, but even in the imperfection, they wouldn't change anything. So they are experiencing something in the present while they are creating. So when they're done with that piece of art and they give it away or sell it or whatever, and somebody picks up a book and reads it, or visits a museum and looks at a painting on the wall or a sculpture, or listens to a song, or dances, or reads a poem, that now belongs to them. They are experiencing that work of art. And if it's a good work of art, it draws them into the experience. So they experience that work of art in the present moment. And if it's a really good work of art, it brings them, it draws them into the now, the experience. Sometimes they re-experience the artist's emotions that they were feeling when they created the work of art, to some degree. It's not exactly the same, though, because every person is different. So they are experiencing that work of art and interpreting it as it applies to their lives. So when I hear a song, I did not experience the same life that the musician experienced. I have different past, different experiences, different emotions. I'm a different person, different chemical and psychological makeup. But part of what the artist experiences was put into that song. And then, when we look at the bigger picture, the universalism, yes, I didn't know the same person that the artist knew when they were writing this love song. But I've experienced love. I didn't have the same end to a relationship that musician had. But I've experienced the loss of relationships. So, in a very specific way, it's not the same experience. But in a universal way, in the part that transcends the individual, the part that touches the human condition, the part that interprets human emotions and feelings and ultimate things, existential concepts, that part I can connect with, and I can apply it to my own life. And sometimes it makes me more aware, or makes me feel not alone, like I'm understood, or gives me a deeper understanding, or explains a bit more of life to me. And it helps me to become aware, to connect with other, the I-thou experience. And my time in the present with that art becomes an experience. And I am changed by that experience, by my interpretation of that art, and of course by the artist's interpretation of life. And I grow from that, and I change from that, and it helps me to understand. And that's why art elicits emotions from us and teaches us about life. So, when I use this term, aesthetics, that's art. Any type of art can be used as a hermeneutic, as a way to better understand and interpret life and meaning. That's kind of what I'm tuning into. And I think that any of us, as therapists, can use the aesthetic or any part of expressive arts therapy, like with Natalie Rogers, Carl Rogers' daughter. She wrote a book on expressive arts therapy. And I think also that when aesthetics brings us into the present, it draws us into an experience of that art in the present. That is a state of mindfulness. And when we think about mindfulness, I think about things like meditation, the now, the present, all of these things that we need when we're working with clients. I think when I do speak in churches, I think that I use aesthetics. I use the music in the service. I use my sermon. When I write, I try to think like an artist thinks. To more exactly I feel when I write. And I talk about those existential things in life. And I draw in examples from poetry and music. So I think the last one I wrote was about home. And the entire sermon focused on the concept of home. And the Luminaires just redid a Talking Heads song called This Must Be the Place. If you get a chance, listen to that. That's what the sermon was about. But it's about the concept of home, that, home is not a place. So I know that this lecture is not as delineated or focused as other lectures, but I think it's an important concept to think about. And I'm interested to know your reactions, and maybe you can expand my understanding and how this affects you in your discussion board. So I hope you at least found this interesting and enjoyable. Thanks.